Welcome to the American Nephrology Nurses Association's 50th Anniversary podcast series. In this commemorative series, past presidents and other leaders of the American Nephrology Nurses Association will provide a rich history of the association itself and of nephrology nursing as a specialty nursing profession. The American Nephrology Nurses Association's 50th Anniversary podcast series is brought to you by the Nephrology Nursing Journal, the official journal of the American Nephrology Nurses Association. We are honored to present this episode, and we hope you enjoy these invaluable and enlightening nephrology nursing recollections.
Hi, my name is Beth Ulrich. I'm the editor of the Nephrology Nursing Journal and a past president of AANNT. Today it is my honor to interview Betty Preston Oates, who served as president of AANNT in 1973. Betty, I want to thank you for talking with us today about nephrology nursing.
Beth, I'm happy to talk with you about my favorite subject, nephrology nursing. It was a great career.
Let's get started at the beginning of that career. When and how did you become a nephrology nurse? What was your first nephrology nursing job?
Well, let's see. I graduated from nursing school in 1964, University of Mississippi School of Nursing. My first job was a staff nurse on the Clinical Research Center at the Medical Center, University of Mississippi Medical Center, and we had 6 beds. 2 of those beds were designated for dialysis and transplant patients. So I got experience early on with peritoneal dialysis, where we hang and drain the bottles. Some of you will remember that, not very many, and transplant patients. And we had no hemodialysis. So patients that were going to receive a transplant were prepared using peritoneal dialysis. In 1965, Dr. Bauer came to the university from Medical College of Virginia. And in 1966, he was awarded one of 14 grants from the U.S. Public Health Service to establish chronic dialysis units. And his award was $300,000 per year for 3 years. So he needed a head nurse. I had gotten to know him through the dialysis patients in my unit, and he offered me the job as head nurse of the artificial kidney unit. So I started working for him in 1966. That summer, I spent a month at Wadsworth VA in Los Angeles, and then a week at Seattle Artificial Kidney Center for training. Well, over the next 6 months, we hired and trained 3 nurses and 2 technicians, and we dialyzed our first patient in December of 1966. So I guess I entered by way of peritoneal dialysis and transplantation and began my hemodialysis career in 66.
Kind of like a lot of the rest of us, a little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything. You got it.
So, Betty, you were there at the birth of our association. Tell us about how the association got started.
Well, to talk about how we got started, I think I have to mention a physician organization, the American Society for Artificial Internal Organs, ASIO. It was one of the organizations that the nephrologists were involved in early on, and they would occasionally take us, some of their staff members, to some of these meetings, which was a wonderful opportunity for us to get to know some people in the field. In October of 1966, I was able to attend an ASIO meeting with Dr. Bauer. During this time, the Boston nurses sponsored a 1.5-day program at Peterbent Brigham Hospital. I think there were about 60 of us there from across the country. And at the end of the program, there was a topic, future plans. The seed had been planted. There was such a need to share information amongst nurses. And the next meeting that I was involved in was in 1968. Again, we're talking about times before we had an organization.
Sure.
In 1968, a nursing symposium on chronic renal failure was held in Philadelphia, and many of us attended. Again, it was associated with an ASIO meeting. And then in 1969, a nursing symposium on dialysis and transplantation was held in Atlantic City. So this was the beginning. And these were sponsored by a division of the U.S. Public Health Service and were held in conjunction with ASIO. Now, Bernice Hinckley, people will recognize her name, she was a nurse consultant with the Kidney Disease Control Program. During the 1969 meeting, our organization was formed, and Bernice was elected our first president. The original name was American Association for Nephrology Nurses, AANN. In 1970, The name was changed to American Association of Nephrology Nurses and Technicians because the technicians were really a pretty big part of our organizations. But in time, there needed to be a separate organization for nurses for purposes of certification and things like this. So in 1984, the name was changed to American Association of Nephrology Nurses, and that was AANNT. Then, in 1970, it was changed to Nephrology Nurses and Technicians, and then in 1984, it was changed to American Association of Nephrology Nurses, AANNT, which we know now. There were very few nephrologists involved in dialysis, so this was a very new field for nurses. The directors of our units were very involved in teaching their staff. The field was so new that we had no one else to train us. Nephrology nurses were hungry for a way to share information amongst ourselves. Regional meetings were held for physicians, and the nurses and technicians that tagged along found a way to break out for our own sessions. Once our organization was formed, we were able to have our own programs with topics of discussion that were focused on our own interest.
It's interesting. I was looking at the programs from 69 and 70 in the meetings.
Yes.
And the topics.
Yes.
And it seems to me that a lot of those topics could be topics today.
Oh, they could be. Absolutely. And I attended those meetings, and I have copies of those programs. And when you look back on those old programs, there's still some of the same things that we're talking about.
Exactly. What was nephrology and nephrology nursing like at that time? You said a little bit about it, but tell us a little bit more about what it was like in being in a nephrology unit at that time.
Well, in the nephrology units, by today's standards, things were very crude. Okay? We used a keel dialyzer, which required 12 hours of dialysis twice a week. Some of the early nurses were involved in coils or cough kidneys, and there were the keel nurses and the coil nurses. So the hours were long. The patients had to dialyze for 12 hours. We used a batch system for dialysate in our unit. We had no individual units at the bedside that could be controlled and tailored for the patients. Everybody got the same bath. The way of fluid removal was very crude, in that you just adjusted the drain tube to have a greater distance between the point where the dialysate went in and the point where it drained. If they needed to lose a lot of weight, the tube had to go all the way to the floor. If they didn't need to lose very much, the tube drained up higher. It was very crude. There were no blood pressure monitors. We monitored patients' blood pressures with mercury manometer cuffs, and just by looking at the patients and seeing if somebody looked funny, that was the monitor. So it was all pretty hands-on, required a lot of observation skills and a lot of trial and error because we had no machine to tell us how much fluid we had removed. We had to get the patients to stand up halfway through dialysis, if you can believe that, and weigh on stand-up scales so we would see if our plan was working. So it was some interesting times for nephrologists and for the nurses and technicians. We had no disposable units, no disposable dialyzers. Our dialyzers were rebuilt at the end of each dialysis and sterilized and made ready for the next group. So, fun times, interesting times.
And it was a time when everybody was working together, it seems.
Working together. Key word. We were a team, such a team. Physicians, nurses, technicians, we were a team.
So what were the challenges? You talked about some of the equipment. What were some of the other challenges for nephrology and nephrology nursing, and maybe for the infant association that had been started at that point?
Well, I think for the whole field of nephrology, the greatest challenge was funding. Early on, there were some dialysis facilities at VA hospitals. There were a few units, wonderful units like ours, that were funded through some governmental agency and given monies. But other than that, there were very few units because there was no way for this to be paid for. Patients' private insurance might have covered some things, but not everybody had that kind of coverage. So I would have to say the biggest challenge in the whole field of nephrology was funding. And then for nephrology nursing specifically, it had to be education. There was just no way for us to share. How do you do this? And, how do you handle this, situation when it comes up? So there was such a need for a way to share. And for AANNT, it was just a matter of communication. We had an organization, but early on, there were no faxes, no cell phones, no internet. Long-distance calls were too expensive, so all correspondence was handled by mail. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. It was slow. But the good thing is I have tons of written communication from friends, people involved in this organization, all about communication, about we've got to set up our standards of clinical practice and, all of those things that are on a piece of paper. So it might have been lost otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. So you and Mary O'Neill, who was president of AANNT from 71 to 73, represented AANNT at a couple of historic meetings. Would you tell us about those?
Yes, we did. And Mary and I were great friends. We were great pals. And the year that I served as president-elect, she and I got to do a lot of special things. She and I attended the first meeting of the National Federation of Specialty Nursing Organizations in January of 1973. This was held at the Western White House in San Clemente, California. And attending were representatives of 17 national nursing organizations. And this group continues to meet on an annual basis and is now the Nursing Organizations Alliance. And that was, one really big thing that we did. And then at the end of 1972, as we all know, the Social Security Act was amended to provide coverage for dialysis and transplant patients. In February of 1973, Mary O'Neill and I represented AANNT as members of the Advisory Committee for the Social Security Administration discussion concerning the enactment of H.R. 1. And this program became effective in July the 1st of 1973. So we were able to be a part of the hearings as they began to formulate the rules and regulations for this act. Looking back on it now, it was a fabulous experience.
Good for AANNT to be at the table at those discussions, too.
And we were at the table early. Really, we were a recognized organization in 1973. So that's pretty astounding.
Sure is. So what have you done in your career after completing your term as ANA president?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I have an even more interesting answer. I took office in April of 1973. In May of 1973, I was reintroduced to someone I had known when he was in medical school. He was a widower with 3 small children. You might say it was love at first sight. We dated for 3 months before getting married. So I found it necessary to resign from my position as president so I could learn how to be a wife and mother of 3 precious children. They were 3, 8, and 10. And my good friend Lois Burnbeck served the remainder of my term, plus hers. So that's why when you see my name, I served in 1973. Yeah, right, just for a few months.
And it sounds like you crammed a lot of work into those few months.
I crammed a lot in, from 66 to 73, I crammed a lot in.
Yeah, you did.
And I did, it was a big decision to give up the presidency because I had seen it from its infancy and I loved it and I loved everybody in it. But it was a decision that I had to make. So I didn't work for a couple of years because the youngest was 3 years old. And then when she went to kindergarten, I returned to dialysis as continuing education director. I did that for several years. Then for about 12 years, I worked with my husband in a business that he had started. In 1992, I returned to the artificial kidney unit as a staff nurse. Now, that was so much fun. I was a staff nurse. It had changed a lot. But I was able to have my 4 patients that I was responsible for. See, and I loved it. And then in the year 2000, Fresenius was given the contract for the dialysis services at the medical center. So I had a choice. I could either go with Fresenius, which would mean starting with another company, or I could stay with the medical center and finish out my years for retirement. And I chose to do that. So I served my last 2.5 years as assistant director of nursing, and I covered the critical care area. There were several of us ADONs, and my assignment was critical care. So I was the evening supervisor. I'm the one that got called when the ER was full and the critical care beds were at a shortage and, they were not turning people out in the OR quickly. Many of us have been there, right?
Well, after all the innovation you had to do to dialyze patients when you first started, I imagine that job looked easy in comparison.
Well, it was different because it was more dealing with people. I was in charge of staffing for the evening shift, and so people called in, and you had to figure out how am I going to cover CCU tonight, and so it was a different challenge. a different challenge. So each of them, had tremendous learning opportunities. It was great.
What short message or thought regarding nephrology nursing, past, present, or future, would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think first I would say enjoy your job. I loved every day in my nursing career. Not to say there weren't challenges, not to say there were days when I thought, I can't do this. But still, take a deep breath, put a smile on your face, and get with it. And don't complain. Second, I would say be empathetic towards your patients and try to understand what they're going through. Briefly, when our patients started and they were on 12 hours of dialysis, many of them had to drive, or families had to drive them 3 hours to get on the machine and then 3 hours back home. So they had many hours involved. We were the only facility in the state of Mississippi. If they lived south or north, they had to come to Jackson. So be empathetic. I mean, it's certainly not like that now, but still be empathetic about what they're going through and how this impacts their life. And then I would say for our nephrology nurses, support AANNT by becoming involved in your local chapters. When possible, attend the national meetings that are planned by this wonderful organization. And it's a fabulous organization. And the network of friends that you develop will last a lifetime. And I have friends all over the country that I've known for years. And it's because of this organization and what it has meant to me. It's been wonderful. And we thank you for undertaking this project, Beth. It's been fun to think about this, and I know it's been a big job for you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. You talk to people for a whole lot of years, and then when you do a project like this, you learn a whole bunch more new stuff and new information. So it's been fun. I want to thank you, Betty, for your service and leadership as president of AANNT and for allowing us to interview you. We very much appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Beth. I enjoyed it.
The American Nephrology Nurses Association's 50th anniversary podcast series is brought to you by the Nephrology Nursing Journal, the official journal of the American Nephrology Nurses Association. This series is owned and produced by the American Nephrology Nurses Association. All rights reserved. No portion of this podcast may be used without written permission. For archived episodes of this podcast and to learn more about the American Nephrology Nurses Association, visit the association's website at annanurse.org. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, our hosting site Spreaker, and other various podcast delivery services.